On June 30th, 1963, a car bomb exploded in a tangerine orchard in the town of Ciaculli, killing 7 state servicemen. The bomb was part of the first Mafia war and was never intended to kill the servicemen. The car got a flat tire and the mafiosi pulled over and fled. After the bomb squad had worked on it, they declared it safe to approach, yet the bomb exploded regardless. A monument to the scene stands to this day in the very spot. This was seen by Italy as almost a declaration by Cosa Nostra that they did not fear the law and were not limited to internal killings. John Dickey, quote, "The Ciaculli car bomb marked a historical point of no return. Until then, every generation of Italians seemed doomed to discover the Mafia as if no one had ever heard of it before. With each outrageous killing or political crisis, an understanding of the problem had to be reconstructed from the ground up. Every time, as apathy, cynical politicking, and criminal complicity reasserted themselves, that knowledge crumbled once again into incoherent ruins. After the Ciaculli bomb, Italy began to remember and slowly, painfully, confusedly, to learn. The reason that the violence between mafiosi was continuing at this point was because of Tommaso Buscetta and Pietro Torretta, who took up place as Angelo La Barbera's successors, an unwelcome act to the Grecos, causing the continuing bloodshed. Enter Miguel the Cobra Cavataio, who, according to Buscetta, started the first Mafia war with the shooting of De Pisa and ended it, intentionally or not, with the Ciaculli bomb. Cavataio proved excessively good at turning the Mafia into a public spectacle, both at Ciaculli and his own shooting 6 years later, with what can truly be counted as the last act of the First War. Cavataio was shot down with 3 other men on the 10th of December, 1969, in what is known as the Viale Lazio massacre. Similar to the shooting at Portella della Ginestra years before by Salvatore Giuliano, the last bandit, the Ciaculli bomb unleashed public outrage, this time directly towards the Mafia. In this atmosphere, the Mafia all but disappeared, many going into hiding both in Italy and abroad. This is also the reason that the commission was dissolved so soon after its formation. Unlike the Portella della Ginestra shooting that ended with the death of Salvatore Giuliano, however, the first Mafia war didn't have quite the same definitive results. For some time, the Italian government had been working on the formation of the Anti-Mafia Commission, otherwise known as the Anti-Mafia Pool. Starting after the Ciaculli massacre, the pool met both success and failure. The biggest victory was, as John Dickey said, the beginning of the remembrance of Cosa Nostra. Thousands of pages were compiled regarding the organization. However, the following trial, ending with the Catanzaro verdict, wasn't quite as definitive. Several mafiosi were convicted, a few in absentia, yet the majority were released because of the time they served waiting for the verdict, and the judges were not left convinced of the presence of Cosa Nostra as an organization. It is necessary now to step back so as to appreciate the growing significance after the first Mafia war of Luciano Leggio and the Corleonesi. Luciano Leggio, not to be confused with Lucky Luciano of the American mob, was born in 1925 in the town of Corleone, made famous by Coppola's Godfather films. With the re-emergence of Cosa Nostra around 1943 after World War II, Leggio was recruited under the Corleone boss Miguel Navarra. Leggio committed possibly the most important political killing of the time in 1948 when he, quote, marched trade unionist and resistance veteran Placido Risotto out of town at gunpoint. He then forced him to kneel down before shooting him in the head 3 times at point-blank range. About a decade later, Leggio began to challenge the power of his boss, the Corleone capo Miguel Navarra, leading to a small war in the 1950s. At one point, Navarra even sent hitmen to kill Leggio, but they failed in their assignment as they were too nervous of Leggio's reputation with a gun, subsequently firing from too far away and allowing Leggio to escape. 2 months after this ambush, Leggio killed Navarra in a car shooting in August of 1958, becoming boss of the Corleonesi Familia. The story of Luciano Leggio and the Corleone bosses, like that of the last bandit Salvatore Giuliano, is a specific tale that embodies the Mafia as a whole. In fact, Due to the violence of the Corleonesi and their death squads, the Corleone have been said to be to the Mafia what the Mafia was and is to the rest of society. Within the Mafia, the Corleonesi are generally thought of as a bloodthirsty and violent group, and Leggio only elevated this image. Leggio's activity paused along with the rest of the Mafia in 1963 after the Cioculi massacre. Leggio's life as boss and later on the Capo di Tutti Capi is not to be overlooked. In a style different from the old days, but characteristic of the Mafia in the latter half of the 20th century, Leggio and his successors Rina and Provenzano spent or have spent almost their entire lives in hiding, running from the law. The mafiosi of Cosa Nostra, along with the Mafia Commission, now occasionally called the Second Mafia Commission, began to reemerge about 6 years later in 1969 after the Viale Lazio massacre. The new commission was formed, comprising of 3 initial members, Gaetano Tano Badalamenti, Stefano Bandat, and Luciano Leggio himself. As soon as the Mafia began to reemerge, another conflict was looming on the horizon, and this was where the Corleonesi would truly stake their claim on Cosa Nostra, and the world would learn much about the Mafia's workings. The Second Mafia War lasted from 1981 to 1983, and is known as La Matanza. This is a picture of a matanza, a fishing move where, quote, the tuna fishermen tow their catch into a calm bay, circle their boats, and wail a rhythmic dirge as they haul nets full of huge, thrashing fish to the surface. The tuna are battered and hauled aboard with fearsome hooked harpoons, turning the water to gore and spume. There is no better way to describe the conflict that ensued. It began when 2 members of the commission began to square off, Leggio and Badalamenti. Leggio, of course, had the Corleonesi, and Badalamenti had his faction as well, including Salvatore Totuccio Inzerillo and Tommaso Buscetta. Not long after Leggio had the council expel Badalamenti, Buscetta, seeing the blood on the horizon, fled to Brazil, and Badalamenti also crossed the Atlantic. In early 1981, Stefano Bantat, the Prince of Villagrazia, and Salvatore Inzerillo were shot down. John Dickey, quote, most Mafia watchers expected a ferocious reaction from the Bantat-Inzerillo group, but what ensued was simply a mass execution of their followers. And so the Matanza ensued. The Corleonesi not only disposed of their enemies, they also killed any family members of traitors, creating a monopoly on violence with their death squads. Giovanni Falcone was one of the most important people in the anti-mafia pool, even today, hailed by Alan Cowell as, quote, Italy's senior crusader against organized crime. Giovanni Falcone compiled testimonies and gathered information concerning the Mafia, especially for the so-called Maxi trial of 1985. Much of the work in getting convictions revolved around painting an in-depth portrait of Cosa Nostra using informants, the loose end associates, and soldiers. The most infamous of these informants was Tommaso Buscetta, known as the Boss of Two Worlds, not to be confused with Capo di Tutti Capi, the boss of all bosses. Buscetta was a wealth of information when he finally chose to give it up, and if not for his story, judges may still not have believed in the Mafia as a concrete organization, and Buscetta, as a well-respected mafiosi, was listened to far more than the mere associates who only knew scraps of information. This theory on the structure of Cosa Nostra, presented by Falcone, was called the Buscetta theorem. The Maxi trial took place in 1985, where there were 475 defendants and 8,697 pages of paper laying out evidence against them. Luciano Leggio was brought forth from prison, where he had been since 1974, to be tried, and Rina was tried in absentia. Far from the previous part of the century where police couldn't touch mafiosi or even collaborated with them, and when judges could see no evidence of an organization called Cosa Nostra, the Maxi trial was a new sort of thing, with 344 guilty verdicts and 2,665 years in prison total. In May of 1992, a massive bomb planted in a drain pipe under the highway near the town of Capaci was detonated, killing Giovanni Falcone, his wife Francesca, and 4 others. Known as the Capaci Bomb or the Capaci Massacre, it was another Ciaculli massacre, another slaughter at Portella della Ginestra. Except this time, the outcry was incredible, both from the people and the following police reaction. After the Capaci massacre, people were losing faith in the Italian government to control the problem of the mafia. The people were not only disheartened because of the government's inability to control the problem, but because their top anti-mafia prosecutor had been killed and the government had failed to prevent this, even though Falcone was likely more hated by the mafia than any other man in Italy, and therefore a clear target. These thoughts were further cemented 2 months later, in July of 1992, when another bomb killed Judge Paolo Borsellino, who had helped convict mafiosi at the Maxi trial and had an in-depth knowledge of Cosa Nostra, which was very dangerous to the mafia, and furthermore was a candidate to succeed Falcone as the head of the Anti-Mafia Commission. If this wasn't enough to suggest to the police that Borsellino was in danger, the police had been told by the mafia informers that Borsellino was at the top of the hit list. Regardless of this information, Borsellino was also murdered by a Cosa Nostra car bomb. Yet it was the embarrassment on behalf of the police in these matters that caused them to step up to the plate in all probability. Alan Cowell, quote, "Some 7,000 soldiers were sent to Sicily in 1992, and the authorities scored successes against the mob, securing the extradition from Venezuela in October of key money launderers, and in September arresting another suspected senior gangster, Giuseppe Madogna. Luciano Leggio was arrested in 1974. Despite being alive at the time, when in prison the power of a mafiosi is transferred to another. So during that year, Leggio's right-hand man, Salvatore Toto Rina, became the next head of the Corleonesi, as well as the capo di tutti capi. Rina was very similar to his mentor Leggio, an incredibly violent man, leaving death in his wake. As Alan Cowell would later say of Toto Rina, quote, "He is the mobster whose ruthlessness finally killed the vestigial myth of the mafia as men of honor, and godfathers to this island off the toes of the Italian boot." Rina was himself arrested in 1993, only a few months before his mentor and predecessor Luciano Leggio died of a heart attack in prison. Once Rina was arrested, his protege, Bernardo the Tractor Provenzano, became both the head of the Corleonesi Familia and the capo di tutti capi of the mafia. Provenzano and Rina had both served together under Leggio over the previous 5 decades. Unlike Rina, Provenzano, despite the fact that he is nicknamed the Tractor for the way in which he mows down his enemies, was not the ruthless mobster that Rina was. He is also called the Accountant for his less violent, more calculated way of running things. Provenzano, born in Corleone in 1933, was imprisoned in April 2006 at the age of 73, after spending nearly his entire life on the run, like his predecessors. Matteo Messina Denaro is now believed to be the new capo di tutti capi, following the arrest of Provenzano. In no way is the problem of the mafia over, and it likely won't be for quite some time. It is like asking someone who won the war on terror. The answer can only be that we don't yet know, but we are fighting.